Welcome everybody to the CSPC plenary, the first 100 days of COVID pandemic, mobilizing Canada's innovation R&D ecosystems and what we learned. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the role of public institutions in mobilizing the innovation community. Canada's federal departments and agencies responded in the early moments of the pandemic through new programs to respond to a range of immediate health and economic needs. This momentous mobilization required the efforts of many innovative and flexible Canadian companies. This session is to discuss the response of Canada's federal department and agencies with the help of specific Canadian companies in quickly responding in the early days of the pandemic. Now, as you watch, there is a Q&A button, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end of the panel today. And if you'd like to fill in your questions there, once we get to that part, I will go and fish them out, as they say. But first, we're going to have some opening remarks from our panelists, and I'd like to introduce them. Guillaume Poliquin, the scientific DG for the National Microbiology Lab at Public Health Agency of Canada, Celia Lourenco, Director General, Biologic and Radiopharmaceutical Drugs Directorate, Health Products and Food Branch from Health Canada, Jim Jarrell, President and Chief Operating Officer from Linamar, Arianne Reza, the ADM Procurement for Public PSPC. I have to admit I don't know what PSPC stands for off my tongue, and sorry about that, Arianne. And also joining us in a little bit will be Roger Scott Douglas, Acting President for the National Research Council. Unfortunately, he is stuck in traffic at this point. Now, if we could all move towards our sort of opening remarks, I will hand it over to Guillaume.
Thank you, David. Bonjour à tous, bonne soirée, bonne journée. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be part of this discussion today on behalf of the Public Health Agency of Canada, who evidently was very rapidly implicated in this slight little pandemic that we're all dealing with. And what I wanted to maybe set the stage for the discussion in that we're going to be having in the next hour and a half is, how do you tackle a challenge of the size of a pandemic like this, when from a scientific standpoint, from a policy standpoint, from a very human standpoint, everything is new, everything is unknown, and everything has to be figured out in short order. You can think of the first 100 days of COVID as an ongoing storm that just keeps brewing and keeps intensifying. And in a way, that's somewhat at odds with how we typically approach science. Typically, science is methodical. It is something that we plan and think through and try and develop the best possible science, which is a laudable goal, but is not always the type of science that you need in a response environment as intense as COVID. So what are the lessons to learn from that, and how do we help build on those lessons is going to be something worth discussing. The other piece I think that's really important is to think about how we, as a community of practice in science, both in government, in academia, but also in industry, we're able to come together and accomplish things that I think in the pre-COVID days, most people would have considered impossible, just too difficult, too hard to get it done. And not only was it done, but it was done in extraordinary time. And I think those are important thoughts. And if there's any silver lining to COVID-19, that would be one of them worth highlighting. And so with that, I look forward to a very fulsome discussion in the next hour and a half that we have together.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. Very true what you were saying about it's a bit lumpy, COVID, isn't it? Celia, if you would share your opening remarks, that would be super. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think Guillaume sets the stage quite well. For me, from my perspective as the regulator, our immediate response is initially to try to understand and monitor what is that emerging threat, what is this pandemic. And that is exactly what we did from the beginning as regulators, trying to understand what that threat is and position Health Canada to be able to respond to that threat. And there's a number of things that we did in those first 100 days. And I'd be happy to speak to during the next hour. But certainly looking to information that we saw emerging internationally, the pandemic was declared on March 11th, and at that point in time, we got all of our staff together and started thinking about what can we do as a regulatory agency to help expedite products for Canadians, whether it's medical devices, tests, in order to diagnose the patients who find themselves infected, or whether it's personal protective equipment, how quickly can we build an access pathway for those types of products, or facilitating clinical trials as quickly as possible for emerging therapies, and start to reach out as well to companies that are in the clinical trial space, in the product development space, across not just devices but drugs, as well as other types of products in order to help the pandemic. We also look to our international partners, starting to reach out right away in the beginning to other regulators with whom we partner with to share information and understand what is that emerging information that's coming at us. And then also leveraging other venues, for example, the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, where about 29 regulators participate, and it's the heads of the regulatory agencies that participate at this venue to work towards harmonization in regulatory approaches. So this coalition convened quite quickly a number of workshops on vaccines. As early as March, we started to convene and talk about what should be the requirements for vaccines, for treatments, and how can we leverage the emerging evidence, the emerging real-world evidence on the disease, and provide guidance to industry to develop products. And then engaging other stakeholders, both within Canada and external to Canada, working with companies within Canada to help with the development of products. And many companies were able to pivot fairly quickly to move towards shifting from their normal business to move towards developing other types of products, whether it's face shields or masks, or even hand sanitizers. Some food producing companies shifted to producing hand sanitizers under quick, short order. And as a regulator, we provided that advice that was needed and developed the regulatory tools that were needed. As of early mid-March, we had already implemented a regulatory pathway for medical devices. It's what we call an interim order that allows for the expedited review and importation of medical devices. So quite a number of testing kits came through that initial pathway. And then into later in March, we had another pathway that we implemented to allow for the exceptional importation of drugs and other products in shortage to deal with shortages that rapidly emerge because of patients in the ICU needing certain types of treatments, certain types of products such as anesthetics, muscle relaxants, all other kinds of products that were needed for patients with COVID in the ICU. That became quickly in shortage, and we needed to have a pathway to bring in products. And then in May, we also implemented another regulatory pathway to expect clinical trials for COVID-19 products, implementing some measures to allow for decentralization of trials, allow for patients to participate and reduce the number of visits that might be needed, and allow other types of health professionals to conduct clinical trials. In addition to physicians, allow also nurses, nurse practitioners, and pharmacists to be able to conduct clinical trials, which we think would be helpful for example, for rolling out a vaccine clinical trial. So those are some examples of how Health Canada responded in those first 100 days. Certainly a lot of lessons learned from that that we'll be taking forward, and we're still in the midst of it, so still a lot to learn as we move forward. But I'll stop there and turn over to the next speaker. Thank you, David.
In the pandemic, how COVID behaves. Plus, I didn't hear, but I want to suggest the workload increased tremendously, both in PHAC and at Health Canada, in a way that you probably weren't as prepared for as in a more normal scenario. So thank you. Jim, now we're going to move over to your experiences with Linamar, and you're the private sector voice today, and there's probably some really interesting learnings that you can share with the group who's gathered here today as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, David, and great to be here today with everybody, and great to see people virtually. Great event to do this, and really a great time to discuss. And it sort of gave me a pause to reflect on really what happened in the first 100 days. And I can say, you know, categorically, the first 100 days in Linamar were the most challenging and actually the most rewarding in a lot of ways that the history of the company has ever had. And I mean, we often talked about, you know, a John Lennon quote, life is what happens, you know, when you're busy making other plans, right? And the first thing that we really did, you know, nail down was we did what I think is most important, is we deemed it what it is and what it was, a crisis. And really, when we all sort of got around that and knew that, of course, you don't have to panic. You certainly, you know, start to make prudent decisions. We pulled out like the old playbook from 2008, which, you know, because there was a lot of shutdowns back then as well. And the complexity, though, was different, because certainly there's a financial element that hit us all, but the complexity around this massive health issue that hit us, you know, while you're still dealing with the, you know, the health and welfare. So at the beginning of this, we basically set out our sort of mission, our plan, and we called this the Linamar Health First mission. And that really stood for the health and safety of all of our employees and families as our first priority, and of course the health of the company. And so, you know, the other thing we also did, thinking back, is the interaction. Every time we had an interaction of a meeting or face-to-face, you know, in a spatially distanced room or whatever, we always started with, you know, tough times don't last, tough teams do. And that really grounded, I think, everyone with a sense of purpose. We also, I mean, underscored that the way we should be looking at this is the best way is to beat this is think that you have it already. And so that really, again, set all the mindset together when we started this sort of mission, you know, back in March. And the mechanics, so I would say, were fairly operational and fairly surgical. I mean, first and foremost, we created a global, you know, pandemic governance COVID team, and certainly established our shutdown protocols as a key start. We did a daily employee health statistics, and what we did is we tracked COVID cases, pending cases, absenteeism, you know, people that are in quarantine, people that are on layoff, people that are working remotely. I mean, we did all of these type of things right out of the gate. Also connected very close to our customers and our suppliers, because everybody sort of shut down, and we needed to have a touch point to understand what are their sort of comeback plans, right? And that was pretty critical to know when we have all these people sort of off. Immediately connected with government around the world. Each jurisdiction had their own way of employee assistance, and I can say, Canada did a great job on this employee assistance program. It was sometimes difficult to understand the mechanics of it, but ultimately I think it was a really well done system for sure. Then really we got into the return to work mode, right? And we reached out to the WHO, we reached out to obviously the Canadian government, the US government, all of our customers, OEMs like General Motors, Ford, to ensure that we were creating a return to work protocol that was absolutely going to work. And ultimately we wanted to make sure people felt safer coming back to work, or equivalently coming back to work, as they would staying home. So that was really important. And of course, screening, PPE, social distancing, hygiene, and certainly tracing were foremost in that sort of that plan. And another major thing I would say that the communication strategy, and we basically set up a very rigorous Monday to Sunday routine, very disciplined, where Mondays we were talking about the financial health, Tuesdays we were talking about pandemic, Wednesdays about innovation around pivoting, right? And so we had a very disciplined guideline of how we would communicate and repeat. We just got that message out there because people were very much struggling and needed to hear. The last sort of area I would say was sort of pivoting to community support. And I mean, we jumped into ventilators with a company called Thornhill, which is Canadian, O2, which is Canadian, General Motors, and another company called Zoll, and did ventilator components or full ventilator systems. And immediately, I mean, pivoted into that very quickly because we had people that were on sort of layoff or furlough. So we were able to access those people very quickly. And then, of course, helping out communities around the world, transportation, Linamar Transportation, taking things to charities, warehousing for the hospital here in Guelph, making PPE, supporting PPE, making protection for ears, touchless handles for doors, I mean, and donating those. So really, that was sort of capturing the whole thing, of sort of how we looked at the first 100 days. So I'd say ultimately, set up a team, gathered a lot of data, right? Made plans and started to execute and repeat communication over and over. So that would sort of be a good reflection on the first 100 days from a Linamar perspective.
Great, thank you, Jim. It's very interesting to hear the steps that you went through to first appreciate where you were, and then to start to fight back a bit in the pandemic, I suppose. You could use that as an expression. Now moving on to PSPC and Arianne, how was life at PSPC for those first 100 days?
Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here. So PSPC is the Public Services and Procurement Services of Canada. So what was it like 100 days? Well, I will tell you that in mid-March, I was busy negotiating files for satellites for the space agency. And then on March 12th, all of a sudden I was busy knee-deep in gloves and masks and N95s and understanding the world of PPE. So listening to what my colleagues said, I really see a little bit of the experience that we lived, because I got to know Guillaume, I got to know others through this. So here are some observations. All of a sudden we were thrust into a world from a procurement perspective where PSPC had been given a mandate to support provinces and territories' health needs for the healthcare workers across the country. So over and above what would have been a traditional federal responsibility of procurement, we took on additional procurement responsibilities at the same time where employees were not in the office. They didn't have access to their systems. Finding and tracking down our regular supply chains was a challenge. When we did reach out to our regular suppliers, or ones we had been doing business with, they didn't have supply for us. They were inundated. So one of the first things that we did in the first 100 days is we put up a notice on our public webpage for procurement opportunities, and we said, we need help. What can you sell us? What can you give us to help? And that was an incredible call to action. We received over 30,000 responses from SMEs, Canadian suppliers, international suppliers, citizens with ideas. It was just an incredible response. And I always curse myself whether it was one of my best ideas or one of my worst ideas, because it put so much pressure on the system to try to sift through all of these, to try to be able to, and I see Celia smiling at me, I probably sent 1,000 kits and rapid test kit ideas of companies that had said, does this meet the needs? So it definitely showed that there was a strong interest in helping Canada. It definitely also, as the days progressed and we realized how fragile supply chains were internationally, that we really wanted to pivot and look at our domestic capacity to stand things up. What could we do within Canada to help address the needs we had in the pandemic? I will add also, whereas PSPC does have responsibility for goods and services, most of my attention at my senior level was on, complex technology solutions. And in those first 100 days, I had to learn the métier of what it means to buy goods, to buy masks and gloves and gowns, and the quality standards, the medical licenses, the interim order, all those things that are needed to create. And again, I see Celia smiling at me, or Celia, my heirs. There's a tremendous amount of complexity in terms of standards, QA, bringing something into the country, creating it here, finding a place to store it, building and unpacking supply chains ideas, and being able to accelerate delivery and all the pieces that go with it. Because brace yourselves, procurement doesn't always move very quickly. So gone were the traditional days of lengthy competitions, complex evaluation criteria. And it's tough. You have a workforce who is really looking at it through the lens of best public value and continuing to do so, but understanding, for me, having it at hand ready to support Canadian healthcare workers was really the first piece of, the first evaluation criteria for me, going hand in glove in the QA. So there's a whole bunch of different elements, and I can't wait till we get into the discussion around that domestic ramp up and all the ingenuity that we see. And IRAP being such a key part of that equation for us in those early days was just really fundamental, a pivotal role when we realized how much Canadian ingenuity we could bring to bear. I'm going to call it quits at that.
Okay, thanks, Arianne. And I'm going to pinch hit for Roger, who still hasn't been able to arrive, and I hope I do justice for his 2 minutes of contribution. So the National Research Council is Canada's largest government research organization, and we sit at the intersection of government, research, and innovation and companies. And from there, we took our mandate to be, I think the best way to describe it is to be as helpful as we could be to the country and to the needs expressed by industry, academia, and by government. In the early days of the pandemic, and it is a priority, and it's still a priority in Canada, we pivoted to do a bunch of different things, but a bit like Jim, where you're describing sort of the priorities. First and foremost, protecting NRC people. That was the number one. Second was to support our clients and our colleagues and stakeholders. So to be helpful to the government issues, government concerns, but also to industry. And thirdly, protecting the health of Canadians. And you have to do them in an order, but they were so mushed together that all three are occurring at the same time. Under protecting our staff, very first thing we did is we sent everybody home. and figured out how to do as much business as possible, or much of our jobs as possible, from home. And then and Jim was mentioning this, when we started to be allowed to return into the work environment, we figured out safe ways to do that, paramount being the protection of our employees as they've returned. And of course, NRC supports research in vaccines and therapeutics and medical devices, and our metrology folks can test masks. And so we quickly deployed every resource that's in NRC that can, support hand sanitizers, other PPE, ventilators, test kits, vaccines, therapeutics, and other medical devices. And to describe the number, it's significant. I'm the vice president for IRAP, and we have done 2,500 advisory services to SMEs to help them solve a business or technical issue around COVID. We have funded over 100 projects to support SMEs, to build products, to support the pandemic effort. And it's everything from vaccines, new vaccines, all the way down to firms that are trying to reformulate their hand sanitizer because they don't have access to the normal ingredients. And I think finally we took it as a mandate to get ready for hopefully being able to support the creation, production, and deployment of vaccines. And currently in Montreal at our Royal Mount facility, we're building a new manufacturing facility that will be able to produce vaccines in volumes that could be used to protect Canadians as the vaccines become available. And I think with that, I'm going to pause, and we can move over into the panel session. And hopefully, if Roger was listening as he was driving, he thinks I did a reasonable job of supporting NRC and his thoughts. So as the panel comes up, thank you everybody. And so the first 100 days of the pandemic, and I think each of you expressed it in a slightly different way, but in summary, was really intense, and there were so many unknowns, and action was required. I think those are really some sort of key points that we all lived through. And maybe Jim, if you could take a few minutes to talk about what you had to do. You mentioned it, pivoting into certain areas, but what did you have to create from a technology innovation perspective to be able to pivot and create all those products that you were discussing earlier?
Yeah, thanks. Before I do that, I think just back to your point about the action that everybody took. I mean, I was talking to somebody in regard to mental health, and they referred to this whole thing that we went through as when you start with, if you have a pain, I had a back surgery many years ago, and I was in pain for a year. You start with an acute pain, and it is severe, and you are like on top of it. You're moving, you're trying to solve the problem and all this type of stuff. Eventually it becomes chronic, right? It's the same pain, but it now becomes a chronic. And I think, where we are as a community today, we've gone through the acute side, we're sort of in a chronic side, and it's, like certainly the vaccine can't come soon enough. So just going back to your point, yeah, so from a manufacturing standpoint, what we did immediately, everything was shut down. So we had all these folks that were off, and we knew there was a need. We knew that, ventilators were a key issue. We reached out to many of our customers that had been talking about it and government and said, look, do you want assistance with this? And that's how we sort of started. And that was like within days. I mean, that was not like, that was, days or hours almost. And so once we got that connected and had sort of 5 or 6, we probably had 8 at the first, different type of companies. But what we had to do is we had to dedicate immediately a site. So our new innovation site in Guelph, we said that's our ventilator site, and that's where we're going to set everything up. So we used that site, which was brand new, and we said that's where our people are going to come, and that's where we're going to start from. And really, at the end of the day, it was sort of, for us, had to pivot some of the manufacturing machines over, and we did that very quickly, to run different products, different parts. I would say the biggest and foremost challenge that we had, Arianne sort of hit on it, was supply chain. It was absolutely the most critical part. I mean, I probably even remembered the sensor number that I needed from Honeywell. Yes. And I'm sure we asked Arianne. I think we asked Pierre Trude. Everybody were asking about this sensor, right? And we couldn't get it, and that was probably our biggest issue, was on the supply chain logistics, because we're ready to roll, we're ready to assemble, we're ready to machine, but getting that supply chain set up was really critical. And the other thing, some of the smaller companies, I would say, that were the ventilator companies, really didn't have the financial wherewithal to be able to take on the quantities that they needed to. So that's when we would come in and help with non-cash working capital or capital to deploy onto these programs.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and I remember that sensor. It was we actually tried to find a Canadian producer to replace it, but it didn't work.
I know. Yeah, I know.
So Arianne, building on Jim's experience and talking about supply chains, it would be, I think, interesting for the audience to hear, a little bit more elaboration on the moves you had to make to find Canadian supply chains and the steps that you took to build them out, because they're certainly more robust today than they were in March.
Well, thank you for the question. I think that's it was really a collaborative effort, because, as we were seeing shortages in the healthcare system and understanding that we couldn't necessarily rely globally, and at the same time we wanted to draw down on for shorthand local talent, we reached out with ISED to look at the sectors to understand, and ISED was lead, working with NRC, figuring out where there was capacity, where there was university-based capacity, where there was SME-based capacity, where there was, large scale-up Canadian capacity, to start to create or recreate some really critical networks where we could have some bench strength. Because it wasn't so much just from a procurement perspective, and we can talk about vents, but I think of N95s, for example, where there was a shortage. How do you actually create a new supply chain with a new type of product that's innovative? So bringing together folks with the right skill set to advise us. And in the end, what would often kind of occur would be a manifest where we would have a letter of intent process. And the letter of intent would allow us to start to negotiate with the firm to see their readiness, their capacity to actually build us a supply chain or a procurement that we want. And for us, it was very novel, because we were buying things that were not necessarily approved yet. That was a whole new rodeo for procurement officers. We're very law-abiding, very compliant, and we normally buy things that have been regulated, QA, tested, or part of the occupational health and safety regulatory system. So that was also something that whether it was practice or enshrined in regulation, that was also an area that we really had to spend a lot of time focus on. And I'm really enjoying looking at Guillaume, because my first 100 days was working very closely with the NML. And in a way that from a federal family, we don't normally have those very detailed conversations to support one another's need. Often procurement works, what is a client requirement? And it's a very static process. And I would say the first 100 days, and what I anticipate will carry on in the pandemic, is it became a very iterative process and very constant going back and forth and tweaking, because we just don't have the cycles to get it wrong.
Yeah, and the move to, because of speed, you had to do things on trust and to expect things to arrive when you need them. And your description of how, you know, mobilizing the supply chain illustrates that everybody, including the people who were taking the risk to produce the products, had to believe that this was the right thing to do and that there would be support all the way through the chain. Which leads, of course, to
There's kind of
go ahead. No, go ahead, Arianne.
I was just going to say there was a little bit of a footnote there. I think that people often didn't realize how competitive the marketplace was. Many suppliers were selling you something that was the same product at the end of the line. So understanding that it was a hyper-competitive market with very limited supply, that was a really key piece of the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Arianne. Now, Celia, Health Canada, as you've listened to Jim and Arianne, and they're talking about this, the needs and the moving of speed, and maybe you could describe the role in a little bit more detail that Health Canada took on to support the needs that were emerging.
Yes, for sure. Thank you for the question. Certainly, right off the start, we went through very similar things as what others have described, as what Jim and others have described in terms of how to protect our staff first, and how do we make sure that they're set up to be able to assist with the regulatory response. So starting off at the end of March, everyone started working from home, but I was amazed at how relatively smoothly that went. We were able to shift over 2,000 employees for my branch. I'm one of the director generals in a branch of about 10 director generals, and all of our staff were able to shift and work from home almost overnight. Certainly it wasn't without hiccups, but we were able to do that, and it was really important to be able to do that because what came next was the need for that really rapid regulatory response. And in the beginning of the pandemic, we recognized right away the need to be able to have products that, first of all, could help with the diagnosis of COVID cases, with the prevention, so anything to do with personal protective equipment. We shifted right away our resources to make sure we could assist with having access to that. And then also having access to other types of products like disinfectants, hand sanitizers, make sure that there was access to the market for those types of products, because we knew that a drug would take time. Drugs take time to develop. It's a new virus. We certainly didn't have a drug available for a new virus, and even much more a vaccine that takes even longer. So we knew that the initial response needed to be that, and the staff in those areas were engaged and mobilized and worked flat out, weekends, evenings, to really make it happen, to bring products in on an expedited basis.
Thank you. And Guillaume, you got to start the discussion, and maybe for this question, it's there was some pretty basic, at the start of the pandemic, supply was secure pretty much for everything that we needed, and then we were hit with the unknown of the virus, and that led to a whole bunch of unanswered questions. For instance, what kind of swab would work to actually collect the virus, what transport medium. There was an innumerable number of product pieces that had to be tested and understood. Could you share a few examples of, problems that you faced early on, and some of them maybe with some novel solutions that you were able to put in place to support, the ability for Health Canada to approve a product, those kinds of things?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And so I think Arianne has been understating her role a little bit. I think she's an unrecognized hero of this whole story. And I will start my answer with a bit of an anecdote. So Arianne and I spent Easter Sunday on the phone together because on the Friday, Easter, I guess, Good Friday, the shipment of swabs that we were all desperately awaiting to supply Canadian laboratories and healthcare providers to test for the virus did not arrive. Therefore, we were in a scramble, and Arianne, through some magic that I will never, one day I hope she can explain to me, managed to dig up every last swab that was left in Canada for us to buy and to use. And you know, that was a feat in and of itself. But now we were left with a scientific problem. How do you take these swabs, which were not really ever designed for this, and actually use them in a way that allowed for diagnosis to happen? What were they compatible with? What were they not compatible with? What type of transport media did you need? All sorts of trivial, if you will, scientific question, you know, that doesn't give you the paper in Nature, but that gives you the answer that you need right now. And so this is a really good example of where there was such important interplay between procurement, finding supplies, the national lab, and PHAC being able to test it out, evaluate it, and say, okay, this is good to go. And that data then being shared with our regulatory colleagues to make sure that the other aspects of the regulatory pathway were respected. And I think the National Research Council is another example of that scientific capacity that could be leveraged to answer these really technical questions, but also important. Another good example of innovation is in this space is early on we were running out of extraction reagent. And so for those that don't spend their days in the lab, that's what is needed to take the sample from the swab and get the genetic material out so that we can do the test with the PCR. And so you couldn't buy any, even with your firstborn kids, because the whole supply was being competed at a global scale. So how do you get around that? Well, that's where ingenuity, innovation, and experience comes to play. So we pulled another unsung hero, Alan Grola, out of retirement, back to the lab to be able to use his experience in doing field work in outbreak responses all over the world, including in Congolese jungles with Ebola, who had found solutions to these things using sort of off-the-shelf pieces that he could assemble together. So within 6 weeks, Alan had been able to scour sort of the Canadian supply and figure out a recipe that worked for us to be able to do our work. And then that's great, but NML is not a factory. We do not have the systems to do that at scale. Industry can do that. And so with our recipe in hand and with some doors open, we were able to find domestic suppliers that were able to take that work and then accelerate it. But then you also have to make sure that the product that you're getting at the end of the day is fit for purpose and is going to help Canadians. And that's where close collaborations with medical devices and the regulators to make sure that we were doing this in a way that was concerted represents, I think, all of the pillars that were necessary come together in a way that probably would not have maybe occurred outside of these incredible circumstances. And I think that's truly, one of the real, I think, success stories of COVID has been to build, to help bring a system that sometimes has been described in the lay press as glacial, and move it at a speed that responds to the needs of the day.
Okay, thank you. And that's very interesting how it's all basically comes back around in a circle. And we've been talking about the needs in Canada and the pivots. And one of the questions from the audience is, each of our organizations, NRC included, have learned a whole bunch of new things. And Guillaume, you just mentioned that in what you were talking about and how we were able to work together. The question from the audience is, from what we have learned, what will we keep in case we have another pandemic? What essences from the processes, the tasks and relationships should we keep and recommend to keep? And it's open, anybody, and Jim, you're included in this because you've had relationships with government and a whole bunch of other smaller SMEs, and I think your thoughts would be, it kind of feels like a government question, but it's not a government question. It's open for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe start it off, I think there's pretty valuable lessons learned, and I can't project from the government side, but first and foremost, I think that business and specifically manufacturing is absolutely critical to every economy, and I think you need to be able to do both things, take care of your health and have business going. I also think being prepared for a next wave, a next pandemic. I mean, that's a big lesson learned from our side, to have this sort of, this hit us all out of the blue, right? And so I think that was really critical. I think, fast and flexible is very critical. I mean, and it sounds, when you have these things, I think is really good. Another lesson learned, I keep coming back to, communities. They come together. Like, I mean, it was really, really interesting to see how communities and how business worked with government worked, business, and everybody just sort of was able to connect the dots. And I think maybe the last thing of more of a philosophical thing is, my health is sort of in your hands, your health is in my hands, that sort of thing. We all, I think, are taking something away from this as well.
Thanks, Jim. Any other participant want to field the question?
So, building on fast and flexible, I think is a good idea. But also, I think the other aspect that was really is the ability to have dialogues, to really get precision around what we mean, and to understand what each other are bringing to the table. So I think the example of the swab question is a good one in terms of traditionally, we speak one language, PSPC speaks another, regulatory speaks one, industry speaks a fourth. And I think one of the key lessons is we've really learned to speak to one another and to understand each other. And I think if there's any thing that we need to carry forward, is to not forget that lexicon we've all developed, because that really helps us get to the results we all collectively want, which is the health of Canadians.
Yes, thank you.
So from my perspective, which is, I love everything I hear, but I will tell you, and I'll be interested in hearing Celia's views on it as well. Procurement community is a very compliant, rules-based community. So dealing with the pandemic, it was clear that we needed a whole new contract terminology, nomenclature that we're still in now, that we have not left. We needed new authorities. We needed, we're operating outside of our trade agreement commitments. And I now know that I need to create kind of a script for those contracting clauses I need when we're in a pandemic to move quickly. But it's also like we're still in it. And it's a very complex piece for us in terms of how, when the auditors come, when they come back and look at pandemic, who got a contract on what grounds, on the quality, when we're going to Parliament. So there's a lot of issues. Like I can't even think about Easter. I don't even think I'm ever going to be able to enjoy Easter again, because it was bananas. And I think everybody in Canada was out looking for swabs, and Guillaume was very gracious because I was very single-minded. I'm not going to fib. I bought every single swab in Canada. If it had a wooden shaft, I didn't care. And let me tell you, I learned a lot about the shaft of swabs. I could see Guillaume and Celia smiling at me. And I won't tell you that there's a lot of different swabs for a lot of different medical purposes. I will be dainty in this conversation. That being said, you know, and I guess that's part of my operation philosophy is what is a minimal viable product? We're in the middle of an emergency. But figuring out when we're coming out of that and when we're going to be looking at all the transparency involved and how decisions were made, that's one thing that, you know, is still something that's really a critical part of the ecosystem of procurement that we still have to make sure that we're always paying attention to and getting right as we go forward.
Thank you, Arianne. Very, very, very valid point. Celia, anything you'd like to chip in?
Yeah, sure. So from Health Canada perspective, what the pandemic did is it gave us the impetus to try out some innovative regulatory approaches that we had planned to take forward, but move forward with them much more quickly. And some examples are with the interim orders, we implemented some approaches such as use of foreign decisions. So some of our medical devices that came in were based on a foreign decision that had been taken for those products. And other approaches is being able to live with a bit more uncertainty on the evidence by balancing that with terms and conditions that give the government a lot of authority to require more data after the authorization, to be able to impose additional terms and conditions, or to be able to suspend an authorization or cancel an authorization. So those types of authorities that we have now, but in the context of the pandemic, we were able to implement them where the evidence bar to be able to go forward with cancellations and suspensions is more flexible. It's not so rigid. Under normal times, in order to suspend a product, you really have to have the evidence to do that. In the context of the pandemic, we wanted to be more flexible in terms of the products we're putting on the market, but we wanted to balance that with the tools to be able to remove it from the market quickly if there was something that came up that was of concern. So that was one, and what we learned from that is we really need to have that. We really need to have those tools in our toolbox permanently to be able to deal with the next pandemic, and that's what we'll be working on, so that we don't need to be implementing these interim orders that we did. We implemented 4 different interim orders, which take time and effort to develop. If we can have pathways already implemented and ready to go so that for the next pandemic, we've got the tools ready to be used, that's what we would like to do. Another lesson learned or thing that we'd like to keep is we did have a crisis management protocol that had been developed at the international level with our international regulatory partners. Although we got to test it a little bit in the context of Zika, the Zika virus, it actually was developed as a result of the Zika virus. We never really tested it fully until we got this pandemic, and we learned quite a bit from it, and we're probably going to keep a lot of the best practices that came out of that, including very high level, frequent bi-weekly meetings at the level of the heads of agencies that were really able to move forward on policy decisions and key decisions that needed to be taken at a strategic level. We were able to do that through implementation of that protocol, and then having the support structures underneath that were able to deliver on those strategic ideas and visions that came out of those discussions. So that was something that we learned as well, that I think we would want to keep in moving forward for another type of situation like this.
Thank you. And if I may...
Can I ask you a question, David?
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question along the same lines that you've been asking us. I don't know if I'm allowed to deke in and nip into your chair role, but, you know, from my perspective, NRC was brought into the federal fold as a key partner in getting us that network of R&D to bring in some of the pieces you've heard us talk about. Can you describe what NRC had to do to adjust to that?
Yeah, so I think the best, and you described it somewhat, Arianne, the best way to start is imagine someone says on, March 15th, everybody pick up your computer and go home. and don't come back, but do your job. So that's kind of where we started. And as we engaged with folks from NML and Health Canada and PSPC and industry, our response evolved. I would say one of the first things was that the barriers and the walls came down. There are 14 research centers inside of NRC, plus there's IRAP, and so there's kind of like 15 sisters, and sometimes we don't want to talk to each other. And so because we had a common need, everybody dropped all of that and said, what can we do to help? And so as we learned what the needs were and how NRC could respond in a helpful way to create reagents, to help firms put new plastics in place so that they could supply test facilities across the country, work on new vaccines. That was not left to, oh, you know, that's Dave's job and he'll do that. Everybody was helping. Our friends in metrology, and for folks on the call, metrology are the organization in the country that is responsible for all the weights and measures in the country to make sure that they're all valid. They, over a weekend, plus an order, brought in a new machine, and N95 masks were mentioned. They brought in a new machine, and they were able to test incoming lots that Canada had purchased because Arianne mentioned they'd lost their regular suppliers and they weren't sure about the quality. And so we were able, as an organization, to help de-risk the deployment of those masks to make sure that they were valid and safe. There are hundreds and hundreds of these stories. Plus, on the outward small and medium-sized enterprise, SME field, we engaged with literally thousands of companies. Arianne mentioned about her 30,000 hits when she put up her notice. IRAP phoned 2,500 of those hits to understand what they were offering and should we bring it back to the government, to procurement as a valid option. And out of that, there were dozens, but it is a lot of work sifting through all of that input to find the nuggets. The thing, and this is a question about what will last, what we are talking about now as a management team at NRC is how do we maintain the connectivity that was created inside NRC with the 15 sisters, but also connectivity into Health Canada, into NML, and to create new connectivity into NRCan, et cetera, so that when we are faced with a challenge, we're working together and understanding the needs of the other, because what Health Canada needs is completely different than what a company needs, and I think Jim was talking about language, and what procurement needs are all different pieces. But if they don't actually flow together, we don't get anything. And our supply chains, I think, can be competitive. As they've developed, they're not competitive at this point on an international basis, but I think with a little bit of encouragement and robust procurement, they can become world-class price-wise and sell internationally and be a viable business without government propping up a pandemic response organization. So thanks, Arianne, for allowing me to get on my soapbox. So we've got one more question that has come in, and it's around international. We've kind of alluded to it a little bit, and the question from the audience is, what have you done to leverage and work with your international partners or counterparts? And do you have any examples of things that have arrived that have made the fight against the pandemic better? And it's an open question, so anybody can jump if they want to go. That's good. Okay,
I
I
could
don't
get
want to
started
be
if
accused
you'd
of
like.
port-
Oh,
Celia?
go ahead, Arianne, if you want. Sure. So international is really key for us, Health Canada. We work on a regular basis. Outside of the pandemic, we work regularly with international partners in the review process. We have a consortium called the Australia, Canada, Switzerland, Singapore, and now also UK with Brexit, with them exiting the UK. They're going to be exiting the European Union. They're no longer going to be a part of the European Medicines Agency. They're going to be a standalone regulatory agency. So we've formed a consortium with these partners with whom we regularly interact and share information with. In the context of the pandemic, that was just increased tenfold. We needed to exchange information on a weekly basis. We talk to our partners on a weekly basis. At the same thing at the International Coalition that I mentioned, where the heads of agencies participate. We have weekly meetings to share information. And it's been very useful in terms of developing aligned regulatory approaches, which I think is advantageous for industry, knowing that they need to meet the same bar across all the different countries is helpful in terms of providing that guidance for product development. So that's one area where we have benefited. And then benefiting from early access to information as clinical trial results started to read out, for example, or other approaches that are being taken by regulators, with having that information in real time and having access to detailed information is very helpful for us as well. That's one way we have benefited from those interactions, and they've happened not just in the drug space, but also in the medical device space and in the disinfectants and hand sanitizer space, so across the different types of products that we regulate.
I was going to add, we actually had a very interesting experience in this because at the beginning, you know, our like-minded partners, we often work with Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the US. And, you know, it was a global competition in many ways for scarce resources. So those normal relationships were a little bit, not fractured, but everybody was struggling to, you know, track down a supply chain that was steady. And it took us a few weeks to move away from that model and actually start to collaborate to say, well, we have a capacity to manufacture face shields or domestic gowns. You know, what can you offer? And now, in fact, I would say starting in May, June, July, we really moved into kind of some interesting dialogue exchanges on the experiences that we've had and what we could do to work together on working groups, you know, around QA of some of the goods we're buying. Issue with end users in terms of their acceptance of many innovative new products that looked and felt different than what was traditionally being used, for example, as an N95 or a medical gown. So we actually now, I had a call earlier today on, you know, talking about international experiences, comparisons, and it's become, again, a tight-knit community. What was I found unique and a little bit unlike Celia's experience was that we were competing against each other for very scarce resources in the beginning. And so that made it a little bit tough. It wasn't explicit, but it was in the background.
Maybe just from the business perspective, I think the thing that we learned was more collaborative with our competitors, you know, some of our suppliers and other businesses in general. Like, you know, people were more apt to, you know, come together and really, in that sense, be able to try and get through the problems. And, you know, a very interesting example that we had was when we first decided with our return to work protocols that everybody will wear face masks, right? That was a mandate. We had to go get face masks, and we couldn't get it. Like, I mean, as Arianne and everybody knows, you couldn't get these face masks. Now, luckily, we've got a plant in several plants in China, and we were able to, you know, when it started over there, we actually sent them face masks, right? And then, you know, obviously the pandemic came around the world, and then we got face masks that came back here. But I can say, like, the supply chain and the cost perspective of those things were quite substantial compared to normal times, right? So we saw a lot of that happening as well.
Yeah, so from a scientific standpoint, it was an interesting dynamic because, you know, January 10th, the first coronavirus sequence was published by Chinese researchers, and so then from that moment on, you're starting with essentially a blank slate. How does the virus infect? Who does it infect? How does it transmit? How long does it transmit? What type of vaccine do you need? What type of drug do you need? The list of research questions is as long as essentially any research agenda on any infection has ever been, but needed to happen at lightning pace. So it didn't really make sense for researchers to go about this in a way that was uncoordinated. And as opposed to the typical rollout of scientific endeavor, which usually is very, very competitive. First to do this, first to do X, first to get that big publication, there was a real sense of solidarity in science, as to quote Dr. Tedros from WHO. And one of the key early actions was, and actually Canada is a co-chair of the GLOPID-R network, Charter Kaushik from CIHR, convened a meeting in Geneva, when you could still travel, very early on to bring together 200 leading researchers and government organizations to set about what the research agenda would be and to help coordinate it, not just at a domestic scale, but at an international scale. And I think that was a key moment and really helped to accelerate the research agenda more broadly and to really allow the different parts of the research ecosystem, if you will, to play to their strength and contribute to that common end goal. And I think moving forward, that is definitely something that we need to fortify as an approach to these types of health events.
Okay, thank you. And Jim, I was thinking as you were answering just a minute ago, was there any price gouging that you felt that as a company you observed?
I think there was opportunistic things that went on for sure. I mean, again, I'm not going to get the exact numbers, but those surgical masks that I'm referring to, which is a mask, you know, just like this right here, 56 cents is what we had to pay out of China. So to me, those are worth like 6-7 cents. So I think that, you know, certainly I think there was opportunistic things going on. And it really, I mean, it sort of surprised me in a pandemic that was going on. But I mean, you know, that's maybe some companies just felt, and I'm talking global companies as well, felt, you know, if everybody wants something, obviously supply demand, I mean, that drives an economic equation. And I'm sure Arianne and you would have seen that for sure. But yeah, we definitely did see some of that happen.
Okay, thank you. Arianne, did you have anything you wanted to chip in on that line, or you're okay?
Well, I mean, it's a tough place to say when yes, price gouging, we worked very hard to avoid it, but like, even when you look at N95s or the medical gowns, you know, China was reopening. There was a shortage of the key ingredient in both those products. So it's really that melt-blown fabric. So it's really hard to, you know, assess, you know, the value and how much people are willing to pay depending on this global shortage. So absolutely, the prices were double, triple, quadruple what we would see in normal times. But we're in pandemic times. So, you know, on balance, it's really hard to figure out the price gouging, you know, as Jim noted earlier. The other thing that was interesting is that, you know, suppliers needed advance payments, and especially on the Canadian suppliers and domestic ramp up, again, because they needed to secure their supply chain, and they needed the stability to be able to pay their their workforce, which we heard Jim speak of a couple of times. It was very difficult to contract with companies whose workforces were deemed non-essential to get them brought in through kind of an FPT, essential to get them to come back and actually do the work. There's so much complexity to each decision that has to be unpacked on many different levels.
Okay, thank you. And so the 100 days, I mean, it was a blur for all of us, I would say, is a safe statement. As you look to the new year, how do you think your work will change? Do you see more people coming back to the office? Do you see different needs? Maybe share a little bit about, from your view, how is work going to evolve going forward? The kinds of tasks that you're doing, etc.
Is that a question for me, David?
It's open to anyone who wants to.
Okay. Sure, I can get started. I think there is still quite a bit of uncertainty around that. You just have to look at the news headlines nowadays with the state of the pandemic. Provinces are seeing rises in cases. We're seeing we're in a second wave. Some provinces are thinking of shutting down. Ontario is thinking about that. So there's a lot of uncertainty. To really say what will happen in early 2021 and when we'll be able to go back to a new normal. I don't expect it to happen for a while. We are able to continue to work from home. The vast majority of employees are able to work remotely. They have desk jobs. As long as they have access to computers and databases, they'll be fine. We do have some employees who have returned to the workplace, our laboratory employees who do research or who do what we call lot release testing for vaccines for Canada. So those employees are back in the office where we have measures in place to protect their safety, make sure that there's social distancing, all the measures needed to protect them from any risks. So that will stay, I think, for the time being, but until we see more impacts of measures such as perhaps more treatments available and vaccines, I think it'll be difficult to think of a plan where everyone's going back to the office unless the pandemic somehow subsides and public health measures have a greater impact over the next several months without having a vaccine. But I'm not sure that right now. I can't really see that necessarily happening based on what's going on at the moment.
Thank you. Jim or Guillaume?
Go ahead, Guillaume.
Yeah, so from our perspective, it's a bit different. So we were probably one of the few institutions that never was able to go into full shutdown. All of our research programs got redirected to a variety of COVID responses, but the lab work still needs to happen in the lab. And in fact, SARS-CoV-2 being fairly high containment level, it adds even further complexity to the question. So our challenge over the next several months is we've had staff work in a high pressure, high stress environment for a very long time. And now we're seeing rising case counts in the community, which increases the chances of our workforce getting sick. And so, we've had lots of investment of time in terms of that redundancy planning, but how do you sustain that over the next several months? How do you keep everyone sort of going and motivated in the face of this sort of marathon response rather than sprint, So that's one of the pieces we're really thinking about. The other piece, I think, is how do we, as a workforce, manage through what may actually be not just a second wave, but third wave or a fourth wave that maybe isn't as high. Because even with the vaccine, even with new treatments, those things take a long time to roll out, no matter how quickly you want to do it. Because it has to be done well, it has to be planned out. So how do you sustain that work plan when you may be in an area where things ebb, people relax a bit, and then things pick back up again? So what we're thinking about for 2021 is how do we continue to be a resilient organization, and how do we keep that fight going through to the point where, you know, some sense of normalcy can be reclaimed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say from our side, I think you hit it very succinctly there, is, you know, maintain vigilance right now. I mean, ultimately with your teams, maintain the protocols. And I think that motivation piece is really important, because people are tired, right? I mean, we're all sort of tired of this. We're tired. You come to work, you're using critical thinking every single day. You go home, you got to critically think to go to the store. You got to critically think about who comes over. It's really up to us as leaders to show, you know, the motivation that stay vigilant. I mean, there's an end game in sight here. As you said, it's going to take some time to roll out. And then again, I come back to, we've got to be ready to act and be flexible, because things can like, as we saw, change on a dime. It can change very quickly. And I think we've got to be doing that. And, you know, inside our company, we're doing stress tests, we're doing sensitivity analysis all the time about what happens if, you know, Europe shuts down for 4 weeks. What happens if Asia goes down for 3 weeks? What happens if, you know, Mexico goes down, right? And it just, you know, and all those things, we're just making sure we're sort of, you're never going to be completely 100% ready, but be as ready as you can be.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a very smart approach, that stress testing. I think about it often. You know, what if half my workforce is out? What if they can't receive the bids? What if the supply chain where we're getting, you know, X commodity is fractured because of a COVID outbreak? So I actually think that stress test is a very important thing for the government to, you know, be thinking about in terms of our own workforce, in terms of how we work. We've also had a lot of discussions, and, you know, it's still an open question about what will the new normal be for federal employees. You know, are we all going to be coming back to our offices, or are we going to be more focused on flexible work arrangements? Are we going to have 14,000 different, you know, is everybody's home going to be their basic work site? You know, there's a lot of different pieces there that need to be unpacked and planned for and thought about, and the dynamics of it. And for PSPC, the organization which I work in, we are the custodian of real property for Government of Canada. So it's a very important decision making about what does that look like and what does our workforce want. I would say one of the things that have come out of the pandemic is, you know, we always talk digital, we always talk transformation. Well, now, like, it's virtual. Digital is now becoming the backbone. Even in procurement, we have a new e-procurement system that came in the midst of the pandemic, but now I see that, you know, the whole thing was, oh, the training has to be in person, you know, we have to have training. Well, people have adapted quickly, and we've actually shifted now how we're going to be running procurement processes into a very transparent, digital, you know, signed way that will be effortless, hopefully for the supplier as well as for the procurement officer. So there's going to be a lot of changes, but to Celia's comments, it is a lot of the unknown. Like, what will happen January 1, February 1, there's so many different unknowns. It's a very hard scenario for us as managers and delivering critical services to Canadians to plan for. So it's a careful eye.
Yes, and the unknown is still percolating into creating new unknowns. As we uncover and create knowns, there's more new unknowns showing up, I'm finding anyway. And if I may, Arianne can take the baton of the Master of Ceremonies. And I could speak a little bit about NRC. And as we look into the new year, what everyone is tired. And it's very difficult to spend 8 hours a day in front of a screen to do your job. And for many staff at NRC, it's relentless, because it's meeting after meeting after meeting. And Jim, you mentioned your critical thinking. You're doing that for 8 hours, and then you don't get a break. You don't get to like sort of flop back and say, okay, now I can take a rest, because you have to do all of the other pieces. The other thing that we're trying to do is to balance the speed with which we work. Guillaume, I think, mentioned it's a marathon. We are in a marathon in this case, but also to do a little bit of planning and think about next July under a few scenarios, and what research, if we undertook it now, or which companies we invested in if we did it now, could make a difference against some of those scenarios that could arrive. And so that is one of the proactive efforts that complements the comments that Arianne and each of you have made around the workforce and how we've had to adjust. And I'm hopeful that we can identify some positive elements that will, as if we imagine a vaccine arriving, for instance, but what do you need after you have a vaccine? Guillaume mentioned it's not everybody who's going to be, instantly vaccinated and immune. How do we support the testing for that? Are you immune or are you not? Those kinds of ideas. So that's what we're kind of thinking on. So I'll steal the baton back. We've got a few minutes left, and I think maybe what we can do, I checked, there aren't any more questions. So I'll give each of you an opportunity to sort of have one last word, and then I think I'll wrap up the session if that's okay with everyone. And we can start with Arianne.
Well, when you say people are tired, I think people are tired. Like, I think of my day, which is no different than any of yours or anybody that's listening to the audience. This session ends at 6, and I have another meeting that takes me till 8. So, and I'm sure Celia does too. So it's just looking at, the new ways of work is transforming what is a normal work day, the blurring of, 5 days into 7. It is grueling. Now, maybe that's okay because we're in a pandemic and we still need that ingenuity and to think about Canada and how to get there. But as we come out of the pandemic, we're also going to have to stabilize a little bit how we move forward. So I think the first 100 days informs our path forward. I think that the key piece is we really are not out of it. Like, every time something is solved, there's something new on the horizon. So I think that that's a very important kind of backdrop to how we proceed as a community. Jim, you use the word community a lot. Now, when I listened to David talk about some of the experiences, I thought about our team, the team at PSPC and the team that are doing procurement. All of us have teams that have put in a tremendous amount of effort for the best interest of Canada, whether private, public sector. And I don't see that going away. And, it's yeoman's duty, but it's a critical job. It's really about the best public outcomes.
Thanks, Arianne. Guillaume, any last word?
Yeah, very brief. I think, we've talked a lot today about decision making and complex systems and everything else, but maybe just to reiterate that a lot of our success as a country in fighting this has come down to individuals making smart decisions and helping to protect themselves and their communities and to help us get us through this. So if I had any closing remarks, it would be to say that we're all in this together. We're not out of this yet, but we are all stronger together. And by keeping those little actions, the critical thinking that Jim mentioned, will help us get through this. So stay well, everyone.
Thanks, Guillaume. Celia?
I agree with what's been expressed. I think we're in it for a bit of an ultra marathon still ahead of us. Likely many of us continue to work from home, so we'll have to turn our minds to what are some of the best practices we can implement to help our teams and help ourselves through the next several months, possibly a year, so that we come out of it in a good space. We hear a lot about mental health and how mental health issues have increased over the last several months that have passed, and still now, given the pandemic and given the economic impacts and and just the struggles that people are going through with having to balance both working from home and having other family responsibilities. So as leaders, thinking about how we can lead our teams through that and think of innovative ways to engage our teams on a weekly basis and help them not just with mental health, but also physical health. We're sitting all day in front of our screens, going from meeting to meeting. We're no longer getting in our cars and driving downtown Ottawa and walking to go grab a coffee. That's not happening. We're getting up and going down the hallway to the kitchen and then down the hallway to the room where we sit all day. So we have to think about ways to get up and walk, and even if it's a walk and talk with our staff, when we're having staff meetings, go outside and do a walk and talk. Just think about different innovative ways to get through it. But I'm confident we will. We've got the vaccines on the horizon, 2 of them reading out really positive results. So I think that gives us a lot of hope. And I think that there's a silver lining that's coming, and we're going to find that we're going to get out of this together for sure. I'll stop there. I see that David has disappeared.
He took you literally. He got up and went for a walk.
Maybe that's what happened. Okay.
Jim, did you have a chance to already?
Yeah, well, I guess from my side, I guess one of the key things, and I joke about this, is I miss people that I don't even like. Like, I mean, it's interesting. You know, I haven't traveled. I would be on a plane 5 times a week, and I haven't been on a plane since March. And so I think the outcome that we're going to see, the world's going to be different. And I think we all have to recognize that that is going to be, there's going to be a new normal. And I'm not sure how this is going to work, how you're actually going to be able to travel. But I think we should be prepared for that. And I think, Celia, you hit the nail on the head with mental health. The amount of mental health issues that are going around today, I mean, it was like 1 in 5 youth before COVID, 1 in 5 youth mental health issues. It's way higher. I don't know what the stat is now. And that's very concerning, I think, as leaders, that this young group of people between 12 and 25, the amount of impact that this has on their, psyche going forward, as well as all of us too, I think is really a critical factor that we've got to be prepared for, in the outer years here, that we've got to really get ourselves ready for that. But I'm very positive. Keep people motivated. You do have an end in sight, and we just got to commonly, as leaders, keep that vision alive.
So I think that on behalf of David and the NRC and Roger, we will have to close out here because we have lost David. I think he's having technical issues, but really this was a very good opportunity for us to come together and share our experiences, right? It was a good cross-pollination of hearing what's going on in different sectors of the government, the private sector, and how we're all going to have to come together to continue to make it through the pandemic. Your comments on mental health, your comments on that we're still in it and coming through it, and the strong message that you delivered, Guillaume, are very important and inspiring, and that we wish that for the I gather this conference is going on for a little bit. I don't know if this is the last panel or part of a series of panels for the NRC crew, but we wish you all the best in your deliberations. We still have 25 seconds on the clock, colleagues.
Thanks, everybody. It was great to do this and great to meet all of you.
Likewise, it was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Stay well, everyone.
Stay safe.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.